The empire stretched across thousands of stars and ruled countless worlds. With iron hand, their banners flew on every planet, and their soldiers marched with perfect discipline. They believed no corner of the galaxy was beyond their reach, and no voice could resist their command. They called themselves bringers of order, but in truth they were lords of fear, and every act of control was built upon rivers of blood among the outer colonies. Whispers of defiance stirred, but whispers were not enough against fleets of warships and armies bred for conquest. The empire sent governors who demanded tribute and soldiers who enforced silence. Entire cities bowed their heads for survival, and the people learned to hide their grief beneath obedient masks. Yet even the most obedient hearts carried a seed of fire waiting for the day it would rise on. The edge of this vast dominion was a human colony, small and peaceful, known more for its fields and rivers than for any weapons of war. Its people valued family bonds and traditions. They honored marriage as sacred and celebrated each union as a promise of hope even in dark times. In that colony, 3 young women lived, and their lives seemed destined for love and duty. Each of them was chosen. 2 wed men who were far away, yet known across human worlds for courage and skill. These men were generals whose names carried weight in every campfire story, though their brides knew them only through letters and promises. The 3 brides were daughters of the colony, raised in the rhythm of its customs and bound by shared hope. One wore her hair long and dark and was known for her gentle words. Another carried fire in her eyes and laughed as though no shadow could touch her. The third was quiet, yet strong, and her silence carried strength greater than any speech. They prepared for their weddings with care, stitching garments that would symbolize new beginnings. While neighbors offered blessings and songs, the colony waited for the return of the husbands-to-be. Though distance and duty kept them far away, the people believed their generals would come when peace allowed. But peace was not in the design of the empire. The governors viewed the colony with suspicion, fearing that its ties to human generals might grow into rebellion. Soldiers patrolled its streets with cruel eyes, and every gathering was watched, every whisper was measured. The empire feared the strength of unity, and so they struck at symbols before striking at armies. The empire knew nothing of love. It understood only obedience and power. When it saw 3 brides waiting for warriors who commanded respect, it saw danger, not devotion, and in the language of tyranny, danger demanded elimination. Thus soldiers gathered under banners of crimson, their weapons polished, their faces hard with duty. They marched toward the colony, under the cold gaze of their masters. In the hearts of the people a storm began to form, though they did not yet know its shape. The empire prepared to make a choice that would burn through the galaxy, a choice that would ignite vengeance far beyond their understanding. And at the center of it all stood 3 brides, innocent yet bound by fate to change the destiny of empires. On the colony, life moved with steady rhythm. The seasons passed with gentle grace. The people worked the soil, tended the rivers, and honored traditions that had carried them through generations. Among them, the 3 brides grew with hearts full of hope for the futures that awaited them. Though the shadow of the empire was always present, they found light in the thought of love and the promise of reunion. Each bride carried a story. The first was named by her people as a woman of wisdom. Her words often calmed quarrels, and her hands healed both wounds and worries. She had received letters from her husband to be a general whose strategies had already turned battles in favor of humanity. His words were filled with honor and care, and though she had not touched his hand, she felt his presence in every line he wrote. She dreamed of the day when his shadow would fall across her doorway, and her life would be forever changed. The second bride was known for fire. In her spirit she laughed loudly, she spoke boldly, and no fear seemed to silence her. She was betrothed to a general whose name struck dread into the hearts of enemies. His soldiers told stories of his ruthless cunning and unbreakable will, yet in the letters he sent to her, he revealed a different self, softer, warmer, longing for the peace she represented. She carried his words close to her heart, and when she walked the village, her neighbors said she glowed like a flame that no storm could extinguish. The third bride was quieter than the others. Her strength was hidden, yet unshakable. She was the daughter of a farmer, and her life was marked by patience and endurance. Her husband-to-be was the youngest of the 3 generals, yet already feared for his daring raids and merciless victories. She cherished the rare words he sent from the battlefield, short but filled with devotion. He promised he would return when the war allowed, and she held on to that promise as though it was carved into stone. Together the 3 brides formed a bond. They shared their hopes, their fears, and their laughter in the evenings. They walked the fields dreaming aloud of the families they would one day raised the colony, took pride in them, for they represented not only love but also connection to the powerful leaders of human resistance to the empire. In their beauty and devotion, the people found courage. And in their marriages the people saw a future where human strength might endure. But in the high chambers of the imperial governor, the three brides were not seen as symbols of love. They were seen as threads of rebellion, ties that linked a small colony to the most feared human generals in the galaxy. The empire could not allow such bonds to remain unbroken, for love could inspire loyalty, and loyalty could build armies. The decision was made in silence, cold and merciless. The brides would be taken, and the colony would learn to bow deeper. In those days the brides waited with open hearts, believing their futures would be shaped by joy, yet far beyond the horizon. Soldiers prepared their march. The colony felt calm, but the storm was already approaching, unseen and unstoppable, a storm that would turn their wedding songs into cries of mourning. The empire did not wait for the colony to act. It struck first, as it always had, with cruelty sharpened by fear. On the morning of the attack, the sun rose bright over the fields. The brides prepared for their daily tasks. One was weaving cloth for her gown, another was gathering flowers for the coming festival, the third was helping her family mend the tools for the harvest. They did not know that this would be their final morning of peace. From the skies came the sound of thunder. Though the sky was clear, at first people thought it was storm rolling in, but then they saw the black ships of the empire descending like claws tearing into the heavens. The soldiers disembarked in perfect formation, their armor gleaming, their weapons raised, their faces cold with the obedience of men who had killed too many times before. The village gathered in fear, but no one dared to resist. They knew resistance meant slaughter, for all the governor had given orders that the brides be taken not as prisoners but as examples. The soldiers moved through the streets, searching with ruthless precision. They seized the first bride as she stood before her family. She cried out, not in fear but in protest, demanding to know what crime she had committed. The soldiers answered with silence. They bound her hands and dragged her away. The second bride fought fiercely, striking the soldiers with anything she could grasp. Her fire would not be extinguished, yet numbers overwhelmed her, and she too was bound and carried through the streets. The third bride did not scream. She looked into the eyes of her captors and held her silence with unshaken strength. Her defiance was quiet, but it burned brighter than any flame. The soldiers bound her as well. People of the colony watched in horror. Mothers held their children. Men clenched their fists, but none moved. They knew what would happen if they dared a single step against the empire. The soldiers marched the three brides to the center of the colony square, their boots striking the ground in unbroken rhythm. Their commander raised his voice for all to hear. He declared the brides guilty of treason for their ties to generals who threatened the empire. He spoke of loyalty and punishment. He spoke of order and fear, but his words carried no justice, only the hollow sound of tyranny. The brides stood side by side, their hands bound, their faces calm. In the face of cruelty, the people wept openly, unable to shield their grief. The first bride prayed aloud, her words trembling yet steady. The second cursed the empire with every breath, her voice filled with rage. The third remained silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she saw beyond the moment. The soldiers raised their weapons and the crowd cried out, but no hand could stop the command that followed. The execution was swift, brutal, and final. The colony fell into silence as the bodies of the brides lay upon the ground. The empire had made its example. It had struck terror into the hearts of the people, yet in its cruelty it had planted a seed that would grow far beyond its control, a seed of vengeance that would one day bring the empire to its knees. The colony square remained heavy with silence. After the soldiers departed, the three brides lay still upon the ground, their lives stolen in cruel display. The people stood frozen, torn between fear and sorrow. None dared to move at first, for the presence of empire still lingered like shadow across the stones. The children clung to their mothers, the elders bowed their heads, and the men ground their teeth in helpless fury. When the ships of the empire lifted from the soil and vanished into the sky, the spell of terror slowly broke. The people rushed forward, tears streaming down their faces. They lifted the brides carefully, as though their touch could restore life. They carried them away from the blood-stained square and into the temple, where candles were lit and prayers whispered for mercy, prayers that seemed too small against such cruelty. The families of the brides cried through the night. The first bride's mother wept until her voice was gone, her hands clutching the garment her daughter had been weaving. The second bride's brothers struck the walls with their fists, swearing vengeance they could never hope to fulfill. The third bride's father sat in silence, his grief so deep it hollowed him from within. The temple walls shook with mourning songs, but beneath the grief burned something darker. The colony knew the empire intended to break them by striking their brightest symbols of hope, but instead the people felt a fire awaken in their chests. Grief turned slowly into anger, and anger grew into hatred. Still, no one dared to act, not yet, for the empire was vast and merciless, and the colony was small and fragile. But in hushed voices behind closed doors the people began to speak of the generals who would one day return. The governor of the empire reported his deed as triumph. He told his superiors that rebellion had been crushed before it began. He claimed the colony would bow forever under the weight of fear. His words pleased the lords of the empire, who valued obedience above all else, and so the matter was closed. In the cold halls of power they believed the brides were forgotten, and the colony subdued. They did not see the truth growing quietly like storm on distant horizon. The children of the colony carried memory in their eyes. They asked their parents why the brides were taken, and why no one could save them. The parents answered with silence, but in their hearts they prayed for the return of the men whose names echoed like thunder. Across the galaxy they prayed for the generals who commanded fleets and armies, and whose wrath could shatter worlds. The empire thought itself untouchable, yet every whisper carried the same secret hope, that vengeance would come as the candles burned low in the temple, and the bodies of the brides rested in their shrouds. The people vowed never to forget the night the empire chose to make an example. They buried the brides in the heart of the colony, with songs of defiance sung softly, so the empire would not hear. They marked their graves, not with stone but with promise, the promise that one day justice would rise on wings of war. Far from the quiet colony, the three generals waged war across the stars, each commanding fleets that burned like fire through the darkness. Their names were known on every battlefield, their victories carved into the memory of both ally and foe. The empire spoke their names with caution, for each one was ruthless in method and relentless in pursuit. When they struck, no enemy lines survived intact. When they planned, no fortress stood unbroken. The first general was master of strategy, his mind sharp as blade and his patience endless. He was feared not for his fury but for the certainty of his plans. He never wasted a soldier. He never risked a battle he could not win, and yet when he unleashed his armies it was as though the stars themselves bent to his design. His letters to his bride were gentle and filled with devotion, and his men often whispered that he carried two faces, one of war and one of love. The second general was fire given human form. He carried himself with unshaken confidence, his presence alone enough to drive fear into hearts of his enemies. He demanded absolute loyalty from his troops and gave nothing less in return. He was known to punish betrayal with merciless swiftness and to reward bravery with honor. His armies followed him into the jaws of death because they believed none could lead them better. Yet in his private words to his bride he revealed warmth and tenderness that no one else ever saw. The third general was youngest yet, perhaps most dangerous, reckless in battle yet brilliant in improvisation. He moved like storm, impossible to predict. His raids struck where the empire least expected and left nothing but ruins in their wake. His soldiers adored him for his daring, for he fought at their side, never hiding behind command. His victories were carved not only by tactics but by courage. His letters to his bride were fewer than the others, yet every word was bound in oath. He would return to her when the war was won. Together, the three generals represented the sharpest edge of humanity's resistance. They did not always agree in council, yet they fought with unity, for they knew that only by standing together could humanity endure against empire. Their names were whispered across occupied worlds as symbols of hope, and whispered across imperial courts as threats too dangerous to ignore. When the message reached them that their brides had been executed, the world shifted in a single moment. The first general received the news in silence, his eyes dark as abyss. He said no word, but his soldiers felt the chill of death in his stillness. The second general roared with fury, smashing his fist upon the war table, vowing he would burn every imperial city to ashes. The third general fell into quiet grief, his face pale as stone, before rising with vow that his enemies would pay for every drop of blood spilled. The three generals had been warriors before, but now they became something more. Grief sharpened them, rage fueled them, love stolen from them bound them together in oath. Deeper than any alliance, the empire believed it had silenced rebellion, yet it had awakened wrath more terrible than any storm, and the galaxy would soon tremble beneath the march of vengeance. The first days after the generals received the news were heavy with silence. Grief hung over their fleets like shroud. Every soldier felt the weight, though none dared to speak, for they knew their commanders carried pain deeper than words. The three men had carved their names into history with ruthless brilliance, yet now sorrow transformed them into something even more dangerous. The first general retreated to his chamber. He read the final letter from his bride over and over until the words blurred into shadows. He had built his life upon reason, upon patience, upon careful planning, but now, the foundation cracked within his mind. He saw not only the empire as enemy, but time itself as thief, for it had stolen his chance to see her smile. Again he rose from his chamber with face of stone. His soldiers saw him, and felt the cold certainty of vengeance. The second general raged like fire that could not be contained. He broke tables with his fists, and shouted commands with voice that shook the walls. He swore he would not sleep until every world under the empire tasted his wrath. His men feared his fury, yet they also drew strength from it, for his anger was not blind, it was sharpened into resolve. Like blade at the forge, the soldiers rallied behind him, for they knew his rage would not end until justice was carved from blood. The third general sat alone. At first his grief quiet, his body heavy as though the universe itself pressed down upon him. He stared at the stars, and thought of the promise he had made to return. He had failed her, yet in his failure he discovered new strength. He rose, not with tears but with vow, that he would honor her memory through action. His soldiers watched as he sharpened his blade, himself refusing the hands of attendants. They knew then that he was preparing not only for battle but for war beyond measure. The three generals met in council. They had fought side by side before, but never with such unity. The first general laid out maps and strategies, his mind already weaving plans for destruction. The second spoke of fire and retribution, demanding that fear be sown in every imperial heart. The third promised daring strikes, swift and merciless raids that would bleed the empire from within. Together they forged oath unspoken yet undeniable. They would not rest, they would not retreat, they would not forgive, until the empire lay broken. Their fleets gathered from every corner of the galaxy. Soldiers stood ready with eyes burning with loyalty. They knew their commanders carried wounds, but those wounds made them stronger than ever before. Grief had become fuel, sorrow had become steel, rage had become fire. The empire thought itself invincible, yet in truth it had awakened the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. In that moment the galaxy shifted, for three generals no longer fought merely as leaders of resistance. They fought as husbands who had lost the women they loved, and in their hearts burned promise that the empire would fall, and its banners would be buried beneath the ashes of vengeance. The vow of the generals spread through their fleets like fire through dry fields. Their soldiers whispered of vengeance in the corridors of warships. Their officers sharpened blades and prepared battle plans with grim determination. Banners were raised not as symbols of defense, but as declarations of fury. The three generals moved their forces as one, forging alliance, stronger than blood, bound not only by duty but by shared grief. The first general gathered intelligence with unmatched precision. His spies moved through imperial lines, like shadows, bringing back every secret, every weakness, every flaw in the armor of empire. He traced supply routes, he measured garrisons, he studied the rhythm of their fleets, until the empire lay before him. Like board of chess, his mind calculated every move and every strike that would bleed them dry. The second general summoned his warriors and spoke to them with fire in his eyes. He told them of the brides stolen from life. He told them of the cruelty of empire. He swore he would not stop until their enemies were ash. His words ignited the hearts of his men. They roared in unison, their fists striking, their armor, their voices echoing across the decks of their ships. They would follow him into the mouth of death itself, for his fury was now their own. The third general prepared his raiding parties. He selected the boldest soldiers, those who feared nothing and trusted him completely. He spoke little, but his silence carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. He showed them targets, unguarded supply depots, communication hubs, isolated fleets. He promised swift strikes that would leave the empire bleeding with wounds. It could not heal. His men smiled with grim eagerness, for they knew with him they would carve their names into eternity. Together the three generals forged plan of vengeance. The first would weave strategy, the second would rally armies, the third would strike with chaos. Their forces united under single banner of wrath, and the empire, for all its power, had no idea of the storm it had awakened. The fleets began their march, stars lighting their path, engines roaring like thunder. The soldiers stood ready at their station's eyes fixed on the horizon of war. The generals did not speak of love, though love fueled their cause. They did not speak of grief, though grief sharpened their resolve. They spoke only of victory, of destruction, of justice. Written in blood across the galaxy, whispers began to spread. Human colonies once bowed under fear lifted their heads in hope. They heard of fleets uniting. They heard of generals who swore vengeance. They heard that the empire had gone too far and would now pay the price. The people prayed for deliverance, and in their prayers, they named the three generals as champions of humanity. The empire remained blind in its arrogance, believing the execution of three brides had secured obedience, yet in truth, that act had sealed its doom, for the three generals had risen not merely as warriors but as executioners of empire, and soon the galaxy would tremble beneath their march. The storm began with whispers of vengeance in the dark. The fleets of the three generals moved like predators across the stars. Their first strikes came swift and merciless. Entire imperial outposts fell before they could even send warning signals. Supply convoys burned in space, their wreckage drifting like broken bones through the void. Communication towers collapsed under precision raids, leaving entire sectors deaf and blind. The empire staggered under the first blow, never realizing that it was only the beginning. The first general directed the campaign with cold precision, his maps filled with shifting symbols, each one representing enemy fleet or vulnerable world. He struck at weak points, forcing the empire to scatter its forces. He turned their strength into weakness. With every calculated move, the empire sent fleets to defend, but each time they found themselves ambushed, surrounded, crushed beneath the weight of his foresight. His enemies called him Ghost, for they could never predict where he would strike until it was too late. The second general unleashed his fury upon the battlefields. He led his armies into the heart of enemy strongholds, storming fortresses that had stood for centuries. His soldiers followed him with cries of vengeance, their blades cutting through imperial ranks like wildfire. He fought at the front, his voice rising above the clash of steel, promising that no cruelty would go unanswered. When the empire saw his banners on the horizon, it knew terror, for his wrath did not end until the ground itself was stained with the price of their crime. The third general moved like lightning through the shadows. His raids struck at night, his ships appearing and vanishing before the enemy could even react. He destroyed fuel depots, crippled shipyards, and shattered orbital defenses. His enemies called him Phantom 4. He was never where they expected him to be. Each strike left the empire weaker. Each loss sent panic through their ranks. His soldiers gloried in the chaos, for they knew every raid was dagger thrust into the empire's heart. Across the galaxy, worlds under imperial rule began to stir, at first cautiously, then boldly. Hearing of victories won by the generals, they dared to rise in rebellion. They sabotaged supply lines, they refused tributes, they opened their gates to the fleets of vengeance. The empire tried to crush them, but its legions were stretched too thin, its command fractured by constant defeat. Every victory of the generals became spark that ignited another flame of resistance, until the empire faced not only armies, but the fury of its subjects. The lords of the empire grew desperate, sending orders that contradicted each other. Their pride blinded them to the truth. They had believed the deaths of three brides would secure obedience, but instead it had awakened vengeance beyond their control. Now every star seemed to burn with rebellion. Every battle turned against them. Their fleets shattered, their cities burned, their people despaired. The war had become more than struggle for territory. It had become judgment. The generals were no longer just commanders. They were executioners of empire, carrying the weight of grief and wrath across the stars. And the galaxy watched as the empire crumbled piece by piece under their relentless assault. The empire that once seemed eternal now stood on the edge of ruin, its fleets scattered, its governors slain, its cities in flames. The banners that once flew proudly across the stars were torn down by rebels and burned in defiance. Where once silence reigned across conquered worlds, now the sound of uprising thundered like storm. The generals had struck, and the galaxy had risen with them, and the empire could no longer endure the weight of its own cruelty. The first general marched upon the imperial capital itself, his fleets surrounding the jewel of the empire like noose tightening around a throat. His strategy had cut supply lines and isolated the world, leaving it vulnerable. The defenders fought bravely, but every move they made had already been anticipated by his mind, every maneuver countered before it could succeed. When at last the gates of the capital fell, the empire knew that no brilliance within its halls could match the cold calculation of his vengeance. The second general stormed the palaces, where the lords of the empire hid behind walls of steel and stone. He led his soldiers in wave after wave, Tearing through defenders who trembled at the sight of his banner, he roared in fury, his blades striking down those who begged for mercy, his wrath unstoppable, his voice echoing in the chambers where decrees of tyranny had once been spoken. He declared the empire finished and swore that no ruler who had spilled innocent blood would escape the judgment of his hands. The third general struck deep into the heart of the empire with daring raids. Even as the capital fell, he destroyed shipyards that might have rebuilt fleets. He leveled fortresses that might have prolonged the fight. His strikes left no corner untouched. His enemies fled before him, for his courage gave his soldiers strength beyond measure. Every act of destruction reminded the empire that its power was gone forever, shattered by the very people it had thought to control us. The palaces burned, the galaxy rejoiced, colonies once broken lifted their voices in celebration, chains were cast aside, and banners of freedom raised. Where once there had been only fear, the people now spoke the names of the three generals with reverence. They were no longer merely commanders, they had become legends, symbols of vengeance and justice, bound together by grief and by love stolen too soon. The empire tried one last desperate plea, offering truce, promising peace, but the generals remembered the brides, their voices, their laughter, their hope. They remembered the night that love was murdered in the square of the colony, and no promise could erase that crime. They answered, not with words, but with fire, bringing final ruin to the empire that had taken everything from them. The end. The empire was dust, its palaces ruins, its banners ashes, its soldiers scattered across the void. The three generals stood victorious, not with joy but with sorrow, for their triumph had been born of loss. Their brides were gone, yet their memory lived in every act of vengeance, in every star freed from tyranny. Their love had become eternal flame, guiding the wrath of men who would not bow, and the galaxy would never forget that the empire sealed its own downfall the day it killed three brides and awakened the fury of the most ruthless human generals.